In the last chapter, when describing her experience at the Chicago MCC, Kerman mentions that at this particular facility, where inmates are a mixture of men and women, they're separated, but they're in the same facility. For some reason, she opens it up, chapter 18, it can always get worse. Every day at the Chicago MCC began the exact same way. At 6 a.m., male inmates who were allowed to have jobs brought food carts up to the women's unit and through the massive male security doors. And later on, she starts talking about how what the women had to do was just sit there all day, like they watched TV.
They're being warehoused.
Yeah, they're being warehoused. And they were allowed to do things like go study, but only like they were in a kindergarten class. Like she explains, like, we're going to go to the library now, and they take them to the library and they spend an hour there. Okay, now we're going to go exercise, take them to the gym. They weren't allowed a job or any sort of free mobility. And
it doesn't say that all the men were allowed.
But
maybe the non-violent ones were allowed, the ones that hadn't committed some heinous crime.
But none of the women were. Kerman wasn't, and Kerman was not violent.
Yes.
There's clearly some discrimination.
And Kerman never goes into detail as to why, and so I thought that we could open a discussion and talk about why you guys think that there was a situation there.
I have a theory about that. I think women on average will put up with more than men will. And that's the reason. The prison system, in this particular pocket of it, just treated the women more oppressively, let's say, than the men, or anyway, more like they were inanimate objects, because they could. Let me point out a different passage on page 262. And the whole last two chapters is outside the Danbury prison, kind of in parallel to the first two chapters being prior to the incarceration and Danbury experience, and the last two chapters are kind of a bookend to those chapters. So in any case, she's being put on the airplane, the so-called Con Air, to go and testify in Chicago. And she describes the situation of all of these shackled prisoners being loaded onto planes. On board were more marshals, enormous beefy men, and a handful of weathered-looking women in navy blue uniforms. As we clinked and clanked into the passenger seating area, we were greeted by a wave of testosterone. The plane was packed with prisoners, all of whom appeared to be male. Most of them were very, very happy to see us. Some were making a lot of noise, declaring what they would like to do to us, offering critiques as we shuffled up the aisle, as directed by the marshals. "Don't you look at them," the marshals shouted at us. Clearly, they had calculated that it was much easier to focus control on the behavior of a dozen females than 200 males. So it's the men that are acting up, but it's the women that get shouted out to behave themselves. Because they will. Women will behave if you shout at them.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's almost
on average,
it's almost kind of like a regression. Like if it kind of feels like going back to, if the men do something with the woman, it's the woman's fault. And it's almost like a regression, because that's not necessarily how we feel in society in general. But here it just seems really like strong, like where it's just raw, like barbarism almost.
But like Dr. B mentions, it's easier to control. So you're going to be able to control the women versus 200 males. How do you get 200 males to, even if there's a bunch of you, it's a mass. Versus 12 women, they're easier to control. They're easier to intimidate also. So, I mean, obviously throughout, they are afraid of the guards, because the guards have all the power. Throughout the memoir, she mentions that. And so I think that the guards know that, the marshals know that, so they're going to play up that card. But once they get to the actual prison in Chicago, but why wouldn't they be allowed to work? Or why wouldn't, I would think that it would be the other way around. They would be bringing in the cart to serve the men. That's usually what you always end up seeing. It's the women serving the guys, but here was the other way around.
And it's because earlier in the book, she talks about how jobs like that are really important to prisoners. Like, it's something that we would think now, like, we wouldn't want to do that. We don't want to go to work. I hate working. But for them, like, that's a privilege. It's something that they want. And the fact that men get to have that privilege while women don't, I just think that that's really, it says something about the prison system.
So what can we notice about the narrative techniques of this book?
She switches a lot from creating a scene to talking about things like from a past perspective. Like there are some scenes where she's attacking it like Piper's actually there, and there are some things like the opening scene for the Chicago thing where you can tell that she's telling it from the past. And I think that she strategically picks certain scenes to create, like the opening scene, which is a scene, compared to other scenes like what you talked about when she describes Pop. That's not her there, that's her describing Pop later on.
Every good writer has to have the power to compress time drastically sometimes so that we get the years of Pop's whole previous existence prior to prison crunched down into one paragraph, one introductory paragraph. This is how this person got here. But then they also have to be able to transition between that kind of extreme synopsis and a fully dramatized scene.
Like spending an entire chapter going to the lake. That was an entire chapter from like a 30-minute excursion, but it was an entire chapter. While she talks about her entire...
They were there all afternoon.
But she ends up describing all of Pop's life in a paragraph.
Yes.
That's right.
And then she describes just one day in an entire chapter.
On page 166, that first paragraph there that talks about how I hit a groove, and the days and weeks seem to go faster. I pass milestones, 1/4 of my sentence, 1/3 of my sentence, and prison seemed more manageable. The outdoors showed me the natural passage of time in a way that was new to a lifelong city girl. I went from trudging through ice, then mud, then grass, mowed by the ladies in grounds. Trees budded and wildflowers and even peonies bloomed, baby bunnies, and on and on and on. And it's one chapter, and she condenses.
It's like time-lapse photography, almost.
Yes.
We see the seasons passing within this paragraph. And then she moves from there to a specific day.
One sunny afternoon.
Inside that time period.
Yes. Maybe perhaps she does that because those are the relevant moments or memories, because we need to remember that she wrote, like Zach mentioned, she wrote it after some time, so maybe memories tend to be fading, or you keep certain memories more than you would others. So I think that's one of the reasons.
Every life is made up of memorable incidents and background habitual material. And a writer that's trying to show what a life is like has to be able to do both of those things, has to capture the out of the ordinary, exceptional times, as well as what is the ordinary time like too. And Kerman does this at the beginning of many chapters, where she'll begin with a transitional paragraph that is refers to habitual or background experience, and then moving from there to the particular.
I think that this is an important scene to describe why she liked Danbury. Because I think before this, you're kind of on the fence about whether Danbury is a good place or not. And I think that after this scene, especially towards the end when she gets moved to Chicago, it's this scene that you remember that Danbury wasn't that bad of a place compared to the Chicago or the Oklahoma City prison she went to. And if it weren't for this scene, we wouldn't have understood that. The scene of the beautiful nature around there, being able to be outside, being able to sleep.
Looking at the lake, and then she...
what it's like to be there.
Yeah. And thinking back of how she wanted so badly to jump in. That was very well done, when she mentions that.
And then we wouldn't have understood why she longed for that place when she was in that horrible prison. We wouldn't have understood that without that great scene, or that great chapter describing the nature around Danbury and her ability to get close to it.